Well, welcome to Old Path, and I want to once again introduce a good friend of mine, Jim Fletcher. He's been with me before on this. The topics that we talk about, though, when it comes to Israel, are so vital to our understanding of the church and the times in which we live. We want to do a follow-up to our last discussion on these things, and well, I won't tell too much about what we're going to get into. We're going to kind of launch right into it. But before I do that, I want to also make mention that Jim is the dear friend of mine who is also going to be going to Israel with us in October. And we've added an entire day to the trip just to cover a couple of locations that Jim is very, very interested in. I've never seen them before. I'll have him explain what those are. One is Independence Hall, both in Tel Aviv, where David Ben-Gurion had proclaimed them a nation back in 1948, and then also what is known as the Haganah Museum. And so I'll have him explain a little bit about those. I want to have him tell you about his ministry as well and how to get in touch with him. What is he actually working on? I'm going to kind of throw that over to him right now. If you have any desire to go on the trip to Israel or have questions about it, contact me through the ministry's website, which is oldpaththeology.net. There is an email link there that you can just send me an email and I can get you all the details on the trip that's coming up. So I want to welcome my good friend, Jim Fletcher. And Jim, I'll ask you to tell us about your ministry. How do people get in touch with you? And again, the little bits and pieces that I've already thrown out there, I'll just have you fill in those blanks. So welcome to Old Path.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I for a couple of years now have had a Patreon page, Patreon. It's a platform for content producers to articles, whatever you have. And my page is called The God That Answers, and my focus is uh, showing people that God exists through fulfilled prophecy, mostly emphasizing prophecies already fulfilled. Because if if you're honest and objective when you look at biblical prophecy, you can come to know the conclusion that the Bible is a supernatural book. So that's what I emphasize. You can reach me there, the God That Answers. And then I blog different places. I do the Israel Watch column every week at Rapture Ready, and so those are the things that I'm involved in now.
Well, one of the things that you and I wanted to go over with this, and you and I exchanged stuff back and forth, and there's a lot of just it's fascinating information to go through, but most people are not really all that familiar with some of the conspiracies that are out there, which we want to kind of delve into, but also the slanted kinds of reporting that we see so often. And you had mentioned one that you read this morning from Nick Kristof. So let's that'll be a great jumping off point because of some of the things that he says, and he speaks for pretty much most of the media and much of the people in the country who don't really understand what's happening there in that part of the world. So let's go through kind of I don't want to call them highlights. Let's call them the lowlights of his article and what you saw in it. And let's address some of those pieces first.
Yeah, this was sent to me by an Israeli friend. I just saw it this morning. Christoph is a longtime columnist for the New York Times, which I call the New York Slimes. It's a horrible, horrible propaganda organ that has operated that way for many, many years. And so the problem with Christoph is he has made it part of his strategy to befriend certain evangelical leaders, such as Bill and Lynn Hybels of Willow Creek. They're both retired now, but he heavily influenced them, and they provided him an avenue to get Palestinian propaganda and the Palestinian narrative into the churches, particularly about 15 years ago. And so what his column is about this time is uh, let me see here what the title of it is. Why Palestinian Christians feel betrayed by American Christians. Now that's an old you know, that's one of the arrows in their quiver they've used for a long time. And so what they do is and in this case, Christoph went to Israel. My opinion is Israel should bar him from entering the country because he's a propagandist and he's dangerous. But he goes and he interviews, for example, a woman, and they're sitting on a hill overlooking a valley, and she very emotionally talks about how the Israelis stole her family farm, you know, and how the IDF bulldozes churches and murders Arabs. Well, first of all of that is nonsense. You have to ask yourself, why would a tiny besieged country like Israel just go out and kill Arabs for no reason? Why would you do that? I've never heard an answer to that, or a good one. Um, and and also the key thing about Christoph's piece this morning is it's another example of accusing Israel of war crimes, but offering zero evidence, none at all. You either interview these people, and I don't know if they're paying them or what, or the PLO is threatening these people, because that's where ultimately this propaganda comes from. A guy like Christoph, and by extension, the Hybels and other evangelicals, they promote this Palestinian narrative and this propaganda without question. Donald Miller, the author of Blue Like Jazz 20 years ago, Cameron Strang at Relevant Magazine, they take these young evangelical leaders over there. They literally introduce them to the PLO. Now, when I say PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, headed by Yasser Arafat, they cleaned it up in the 90s and refer to it now as the Palestinian Authority. It's the same people, same terrorist organization. They lie. And they know that there are useful idiots in the West that will just lap up whatever they're saying.
Right.
And, a guy like Miller in 2012 outright accused Israel of war crimes, never offered any evidence. I reached out to him repeatedly. He would never talk to me. And that's a pretty good clue that they know that they can't back up what they're saying. And so, again, the Christoph piece this morning, really infuriating, but it's his stock and trade. It's what he does. The old idea that Bible prophecy people in American churches are driving U.S. foreign policy, that they're influencing Israel in doing these. I'm sorry, that's laughable. The two governments, the American and the Israeli government, might be respectful to prophecy people, and they appreciate the sport. I honestly don't think they believe most of what prophecy people are selling.
Right.
And so the idea that there's collusion there is ridiculous. But that's the kind of stuff Christoph is doing, and I don't think, I mean, I will, but I don't think many people will refute what he's saying. And that's a problem.
Yeah, unfortunately, most people don't get invested, I guess you can say, enough into the topic to even have the discussion, which is kind of why we're doing what we're doing here today. But interestingly enough, Donald Miller, I remember back when he, did one of his little trips over there, came back and he was continuing that stupid narrative that Gaza is the world's largest outdoor prison. And all the while, what we're now finding out, obviously, because Israel finally had to go in, was just the terror infrastructure that had been being built since the day that Israel left. And it was obviously the whole thing has turned out to be a horrible experiment that turned out to have devastating effect. So, this is unfortunately one of those things that that whole Land for Peace push ended up giving us what we see in Gaza right now. Unfortunately, this is kind of the world in which we live, and now everything's changed there. But Christoph is really just repeating the same tired canards that have been going on for decades, since Israel took back so much of the territory that we call the West Bank, because they were unprovoked in an attack. But again, that's to the victor goes the spoils. They were just doing what they were doing, but 67 changed everything. And when we're there, we see it. It's everywhere that you can see. Unfortunately, Israel took back the land that really kind of compromised them. 67 should have proven that to anyone who wanted to see the vulnerable state that Israel was in 67, that they took back that territory, which, had they not, who knows how 73 would have wound up.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. The fact that they had the Sinai in 73 at least gave them a buffer
Right.
to not be overrun. But the West doesn't care about any of these things, and it
Right.
pains me to say, specifically today, evangelical leaders don't care about those things. They have very much moved to the left, and I think the biggest tragedy of many tragedies in that is that your average pew sitter in the churches today in America has no clue about any of that.
Right.
They just don't. They I'm pinballing here for just a second, but just last week I saw a local mega church in my area was they were welcoming a guy named Brad Lomenick into their church to speak. He's a leadership guru in evangelical circles, and he used to be the head of Catalyst conferences, which we've talked about before. Well, Brad Lomenick has left-wing views, and this pastor, I don't know him personally, but I don't think I think he's just not discerning. I don't think he has a sinister thing in mind there, but they're allowing people like this into their pulpits to influence the people. And for example, in the Catalyst conferences in the past, I went to 3 or 4 of them over the years. They could be counted on to trot out an anti-Israel speaker like Lynn Hybels. And so they're eventually reaching hundreds of thousands of pastors across the country and youth pastors. And so this propaganda is spread in many different ways. And it's really dangerous because, what you were talking about earlier, some of the stuff that we hear that Gaza and Bethlehem are open air prisons. Okay. And these guys I know, like Miller and Shane Claiborne, they've literally written or spoken that, for example, Bethlehem is surrounded by walls, that it's walled in. Well, I was talking to Shane Claiborne one day on the phone, and he had expressed this, and I said, I was there 2 weeks ago, and there's not 4 walls around that town. There's one on the highway to keep the Arabs from shooting and killing Jews driving down the highway. There's no open air prison anywhere in Israel for the Arabs. Silence,
Right.
because he knows he doesn't have to answer. I'm just one guy calling him out. He knows that's not going to get out there very far. And so they keep lying for the PLO. That all those charges, the open air prison, the murdering Arab children, bulldozing churches, that comes out of the brain of Mahmoud Abbas and all his cronies with the PLO. It originated with Arafat, who was an evil, evil serial killer. And these people are never called on this stuff. But as we go into this discussion today about some of the conspiracy stuff going on now with Gaza, I mean, this stuff has been around a long time, and the Arabs learned a long time ago that they can count on useful idiots in America to carry this nonsense to the masses.
Right. Well, and that's where we are today. And really the reason that I wanted to, kind of do a follow-up. Let's do one thing very, very briefly, and it'll be kind of to answer the people that are saying Israel doesn't have a right to the land, and they're really not God's people. I want to make sure that we can refer back to what you and I had done the last time where we talked a little bit about this. But the long and the short of it, the simple answer to it, when we read Genesis chapter 12, that's the promise to the nations. And when Paul talks in Galatians 3, where a lot of Christians say, well, there is no Israel because we're all spiritual Israel through Abraham. Paul is the only place that he quotes anything in his argument for that is from Genesis chapter 12, which is a plural promise to the nations. It's to mankind. And that's through the person of Jesus Christ. In you, the nations will be blessed. Verse 3 of chapter 12. What the most of the church does not understand, and it's one of the reasons why it's important that we go to Israel and let people know this and educate them. There is a singular series of promises that God makes in Genesis chapters 15 to 17, which are singular to the nation of Israel through Abraham and then through Isaac. And it's for the land and for the people, independent of what is spoken of in chapter 12, which is why Paul is very, very careful only to use chapter 12 as his basis for his argument in Galatians 3. He leaves alone the promise made to the people with the land that is found in chapters 15 through 17. So when people want to come to us and say, well, there is no Israel, and especially the ones that are there now are not following God, so they're clearly not his people, they misunderstand all of the prophecy that God would restore them to the land, and that the promise made to the nations is to Jew and Gentile alike in Jesus to those who believe, but that it never nullified. In fact, think of it this way, chapter 12 predates chapters 15 to 17. So the promise to the nations is through Jesus, Jew and Gentile alike, who could be born again and be part of his body. But God has future plans because it's a forever promise that he makes in 15 to 17 to Abraham through Isaac and then Jacob, the sons of Jacob, the children of Israel in the land and as a people. Those two things are parallel, but they do not mix. They're separate. So, of course, anybody that's going to be saved is going to be saved through the person of Jesus Christ. It doesn't mean that there's a dual covenant like Hagee and those kind of people are talking about. It just simply means that the nation, the people, and the land belongs to a promise independent of what Paul's talking about to Galatians. It's chapters 12, verses 15 to 17. Those two things are independent thoughts as God is explaining. So I figured I'd throw that out to you before we get into the rest and see however you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, and the land promise from Abraham through Isaac to the Jewish people is unconditional, and you never hear the critics mention that.
Right.
That account is really fascinating, and it's clear from that account that man has no part in keeping any conditions to fulfill that. It was a unconditional promise instigated by God himself and only him.
Right.
And because of that, it can't be broken. And then the other thing that always leaves me dismayed about a lot of Christians, how in the world they can deny that ethnic Jews today in Israel are not related to their ancestors is beyond me.
Right.
That in itself is an anti-Semitic statement.
Right.
You wouldn't say that of any other ethnic group in the world. It's only the Jews whose lineage and heritage is questioned. The Jews that live in the modern state of Israel today are related to their ancestors.
Right.
And they return to reclaim their ancestral land in our time. It's very, very obvious, but it's not obvious to people that don't want to believe it.
And there you go. And
that's why you have the propaganda.
And unfortunately, most of the time, the people are uneducated because the pastors are uneducated. So if a person professes to be a believer and doesn't understand this, it's because it's either never been pointed out or they've just never looked at it for themselves. And you make mention of something that it's really important that we make sure that people understand this. The promise of the land and the people was, as God said in his own words, it's an everlasting covenant that he makes with them. So, like you say, it's unconditional. Whether or not they would be in the land was conditional, whether or not they were walking with him. But ultimately, he said, I'm going to bring you back regardless of your spiritual state, because the timing is right. It's very much the same thing as we saw with Babylon into the Persian. When they finally came back into the land, it was done through a secular source and it was bankrolled by them. So the people that say, well, Israel's not really Israel, they're just part of the New World Order, and it was unsaved people that bankrolled them getting back in, and they're in unbelief. Yeah, like the Babylonian into the Persian captivity that God brought them back. And it's why we read the prophets every morning that we're in Israel. When we first get on the bus, we will read a passage from one of the prophets about God restoring them to the land. So I think people need to understand the distinction. God made a promise to the land and to the people that was everlasting, but he also told them, if you rebel against me, you'll be displaced for a time, but ultimately you will always be restored. And I believe that we've seen them restored for the last time in a fulfillment of Amos chapter 9, verses 14 and 15. I think that's what we're seeing now. So, people need to understand the distinction between those two things, because it may seem like a minor distinction, but it's huge. It's massive.
And that's the incredible thing to me today about the critics. And I'm talking about the people within the church. Secular world is going to mock and do that. The biggest threat today is within the church. And so it's amazing to me that you hear criticisms of Israel by church leaders. And one of the biggest is, well, those people aren't even religious. They're not believers. They're secular or pagan or whatever. Hello. If you look at the prophetic timeline in the Bible, they're exactly right now where they're supposed to be. I point this out to people all the time, and they don't know this, but if you criticize Israelis today for example, not believing in Jesus, that's one of the big charges, okay? What does Ezekiel 37 tell us they're going to do? Over 2,000 years ago, we were told specifically they will first come physically back to the land, and then God himself says, I will change their spiritual condition forever. Okay, they're right exactly on the timeline, chronology, where they're supposed to be. They've come back to the land, and as you well know, anybody that's been over there or has Israeli friends, that country is in the middle of a spiritual transformation right now.
Mm-hmm.
So it blows my mind that you explain this to people. And so to answer the charge that, oh, they're not religious and they've rejected God and all that. Okay, they're physically back in the land. They started coming back en masse in the 1880s. Israel was established in 1948. They're there physically. They have a great standing army. And now, if you like in the fall when we go, you can walk through the old city in Jerusalem and you'll see posters in Hebrew that say Messiah is coming. These people are in the middle of a transformation. Why does this not satisfy as an answer the critics? I'll always maintain, they don't want to believe and accept your answer because they don't like Jews. They don't like Jewish people.
Right.
They don't like Israel. They can tolerate dead Jews from the Holocaust, but if you're talking about the IDF and a strong, vibrant country over there, economically and every other way, that people don't like that. And unfortunately, it's a lot of people in the church don't like that. And that's just where we are.
And since we're talking about people in the church, you have the other end of the spectrum, from the people who don't see it to the people who do see it, like, the posters that you talk about, and they're huge. Some of them are. I've shown you the picture of the one of Menachem Schneerson in Tel Aviv. It was like a 40 or 50-foot tall billboard, electronic billboard of his picture, and ultimately, he walks among us, kind of a thing. So there is a real desire for the Messiah, and that's where the people in the church that do pay attention to this, that I think are completely all wet, would say, yeah, well, they're waiting for the Messiah, but they're waiting for the wrong one. Well, some are going to be suckered in by the false Messiah, but some will genuinely come to know who he is. We know that from Zechariah. They're going to look upon him whom they pierced. So the idea that there's a desire for it also means that there is the door open for deception, and somebody's going to step into that position, of course, but that doesn't change the fact that Israel's got to be in the land for that whole scenario to lay out. So I think people need to understand the difference between those. The people who say they're not the rightful people in the land, to the ones who might say, well, they are, but they're in total unbelief and they're going to buy into this Messiah. Look, see the posters? they're going to, follow up, or they're going to line up behind the Antichrist. Well, a number of them are going to know exactly who the bad guy is, and they're going to leave from him. And God's going to protect those people. So just because there are some who are buying into a false Messiah doesn't mean that the whole nation is in a place of corruption. They're just put in the position where it's all going to unfold and they will have a decision to make.
And of course, we don't say that Schneerson is the Messiah. That's not the point. That's obscuring what we're talking about.
Right.
The Bible is crystal clear about what is going to happen in broad terms. And if you look at that and you look at what is going on there today, it fits like a glove. It's exactly that thing. I want to just real quick, this is a kind of a side thing, but I think it has relevance. Because you know me, I love to know the foundations. I want to know why we're where we are today. And this goes back a long way. I got a book in the 90s called Beyond the Point of No Return. It was self-published by a United Methodist pastor who understood the rot in that denomination, the liberalism that had taken over 70 years before. So you're now talking 100 years ago. He wrote something that really blew my mind. He said 70 years of this kind of mishandling of the Bible has spawned such systemic evil, theological ignorance, and moral discord throughout the church that it will take a miracle greater than the collapse of communism to purge it from the church. Okay, he's that quote should be shouted from the rooftops. That book should be read by every pastor in the country. It should be in every church library. Instead, you have Rick Warren's books, Max Lucado. Their books are spilling off the shelves in bookstores. That's who the pastors promote from the pulpit. They're not promoting the truth like this man just wrote. And so my point is that the foundation of 100 and more years of horrible teaching coming from the seminaries has brought us to where we are today. And so I think you can make a direct link from the unbelievers in academia then in the seminaries to why Christians today will read Nicholas Kristof's column this morning and just swallow it hook, line, and sinker.
Right.
They don't have any biblical foundation at all. And that's one of the biggest problems in the American church.
Now, I am super glad that you did that because this is the perfect segue point for this. Because there are so many people in the church, like I say, they're not the ones that are just eyes closed and not even seeing the miracle that is modern Israel, but the ones who do see it, who buy into all of the conspiracies. And so the conspiracy, the big one that's out there right now, when you get beyond the idea, well, the people who put them in place, it's not really the God that put them in place, it's the Rockefellers, it's, all of that kind of stuff, and all the New World Order. They're the ones who set the whole thing up. It's the British mandate and all of that kind of stuff. It's the UN, it's take your pick. And that's who's actually put them back in the land. It's not because God's done something supernatural. And so that operating premise means that everything that the Israeli government does has some nefarious, motivation behind it. And so that brings us to the events of October the 7th, because here's one of the big conspiracies carried out by much of the church. Israel and the Netanyahu government knew exactly what was going to be taking place on October the 7th because it had already been told to them what they were going to be doing. And they stood aside and allowed it to go because Netanyahu wanted to go and take over Gaza. So that's kind of the big, I'm just doing it in the biggest of the big picture, but that's the conspiracy that's out there now. So I thought this would be a good time for us to go ahead and look at what was it that was actually found? What was the document that they're referring to? When was it found is a very important matter. And why was the response so slow? And let's tackle it kind of in a piece by piece way. So let's start with what was found during the Bennett administration about Hamas's plans.
Yeah, I mean, Hamas had planned this obviously for a while, and and it's now coming out, well, I think these are credible stories, that there were groups and individuals in the West that had advanced warning that it was coming. That's a conspiracy theory I can believe. For one thing, the protesters out there now are kind of hinting at this, that it, it was, and so um, they planned it for a while. The story is that it was almost going to be coordinated with Hezbollah. It would be another attack from the north and south on Israel as the 6 Day War, the Yom Kippur War. Um, and that I guess Sinwar and Hamas kind of jumped the gun, and they went in early. Um, but uh, but this idea that they had planned this for a while and then they launched it. That has led to, as you mentioned, some genuine conspiracy theories that somehow the Israelis, the leadership, wanted this to happen. There charges that the Israeli government was paying Hamas and that sort of thing, or that it was a little bit like the U.S. in, say, 1940, 41. Roosevelt knew that we were going to have to get into the war at some point, but he wanted to delay it as long as he could because our army wasn't ready. And so they did have a little bit of advance warning about Pearl Harbor, at least hours, if not days or weeks. And Roosevelt stood down because the American public at the time was we didn't want to get involved in a foreign war. He knew that if Japan hit us like that would change that equation, and it did. And so there's always been the conspiracy that Roosevelt knew. The truth is, we'll never know. There's no paper trail. There's no way to prove that. It makes a little bit of sense, but you can't prove it. There's less evidence that Netanyahu and the Israeli government knew and stood down for some reason. Maybe they a little bit like Roosevelt knew that eventually they were going to have to deal with Gaza in a systematic way. And they thought, well, it's going to take some horrible tragedy for us to absorb before the people will get behind that. There's no evidence that Netanyahu and the leadership did that. Now, were there operational failures? Oh, obviously there were. He was not told that morning early that there were situations flaring up on the border, and so I don't believe that particular theory, and I'll tell you in this way. I'll name drop a little bit. I've talked about this before, but the last 10 years Netanyahu's father Ben-Zion lived, every time I would go to Israel, I would spend some time with him in the family home. And I'm just telling you what I saw, the bust of Yoni, the fallen commander at Entebbe, in their dining room, the photos, family photos, the things that he told me. Ben-Zion Netanyahu is as strong a Zionist as has ever lived. And there's no way that family would have anything to do with allowing a devastating existential threat to the people for some political reason. That didn't happen. It's not going to happen. Benjamin Netanyahu may be a politician's politician. He is the only one of his family that is, but he's not so much a politician that he would absorb 1,200 murders and Jewish children being burned and the women raped. That didn't happen. So to the critics that say that took place, my answer is, what is your evidence?
Right. And he wouldn't need the events of October the 7th to have a reason to go into Gaza. The rockets flying out of there every time that they, have a hangnail was reason enough. So I've never bought into that. But I think people need to understand a bit more of the timeline in this, because from the things that I read early on, and I've never heard anything that ever countered it, was that there was intelligence that was found, and that's not a question. To the point where here's a conspiracy that you hear. Well, there's paperwork there that they found and discovered as intelligence, where Hamas was saying they were going to use hang gliders, and all at once, up and down the from north to south, they were going to flood out of Gaza into Israel, and they were going to do all of this, that, and the other thing. And everything that I've read, that part is absolutely true. That was it was found during the time of Naftali Bennett, before Netanyahu. And the military brass looked at it and thought, it's fanciful, but they can't pull this off. They're not coordinated enough to do it. And it was never taken seriously. It was more viewed as something in a perfect world. This is what Hamas would like to do, but they don't have the ability. And it was never followed up on. It was actually put aside. And by the time that Netanyahu comes into office, there's questions as to whether or not he was ever even briefed on it before the event. So I've never seen anything that would tell me that somebody dug up something that was just put aside during Bennett's administration. And as soon as Bibi comes into office, hey, you need to look at this. This is something that we found intelligence, and we think that this is going to take place. And again, if people would go there and look, and if they drove that whole north to south border of Gaza into Israel, a lot of that is just very sparsely populated. And it's mainly kibbutzes, and that's why you found when they went in, they were easily able to take hostages. They were, killing women and children, and all the things that we saw. That's what you would expect for a large-scale incursion coming out of Gaza, and you're not going to get a lot of good intelligence of where are they, who are they, what are they doing. You don't have assets on the ground to give you that kind of information. That's not me making excuses. That's just saying, take a look at the land and take a look at who the people were. That's why you notice there wasn't much in the way of military, and it was done on a holiday. So once again, to Israel's fault, they're always on a constant war footing, but I don't think that they were ever expecting something like that. They let their guard down, and that was the mistake that they made. But the idea that it was some nefarious thing, that Netanyahu's back there, like you would figure, wringing his hands saying, I can't wait for all these people to die so that I have a reason to go in and take Gaza, not even discussing the idea that because rockets started coming out of the north with Hezbollah, that they took them out as well. So you can't tell me it was some grand scheme of things when there's really no evidence that Netanyahu even knew of the planning that they had talked about, and how it was completely dismissed by the brass at the time during Bennett's administration.
And what's really gross about that is Bennett, who was at one time Netanyahu's protege, and then he got tired of waiting around because Netanyahu wouldn't step aside and retire. In the middle of a shooting war, an existential war, Bennett is accusing Netanyahu of all this stuff. As you said, the intel came in his brief time in office, and yet it's somehow Bibi's fault.
Yeah.
This is a product of the hatred for Netanyahu is unlike anything I've ever seen for a politician. He has so many vicious enemies in and outside of Israel. I don't know how the guy gets out of bed every morning. But the charge that he knew and let it happen, no, you'll never get me to believe that.
Yeah, and that's such is the nature of conspiracies. You don't have to have good information. You don't have to have good evidence of it. It's the therefore. So here's how therefore works in conspiracies. A document was found, and they ended up doing what was found on the document. Therefore, Israel must be complicit. That's kind of the way that the whole thing works. So, this is the idea that Netanyahu needed a reason to go into Gaza is just silly. If he wanted to, he could have waited for the next time that rockets came out, and he could do a limited incursion in there, find a few of the tunnels and some of the infrastructure, and they've got the door wide open for it at that point. It wouldn't be a difficult thing to do. But again, in the mind of a conspiracy theorist, you've just got to go ahead and jump to every radical conclusion and buy into every potential conspiracy to build your case. But it's really sad that we've watched so many people in the church who should know better buy into all of this nonsense and never ask the follow-up questions. What's in it for Israel? Because they could
Yeah.
have done all of this without the loss of life. And really, this is hamstrung Netanyahu horribly, and it's thrown the nation into complete chaos, which is never good for a leader.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, uh, again, the idea that they would let that come through, I'll never believe that Netanyahu allowed that to happen, knowing that women would be raped, tortured, and murdered in front of their families, that their children would be burned alive. No, no, that didn't happen. Now, the critics, what I don't understand about the critics is their maximalist positions. Everything is black and white in that. Could it not, two things can be true at the same time in certain situations. And going back to what you mentioned at the beginning, is it true that some of Israel's founders were communist, socialist? Yeah, that's not a secret. If it's a secret, it's an open secret. Ben Gurion, I don't think, was a believer. Um, they had a socialist government until 1977 when Menachem Begin won for the first time, and then kind of turned things to the right. So why do we have to have a problem with all that? Yeah, some of the founders were not maybe what we would want morally or biblically or anything like that, but it doesn't mean that conspiracy goes all the way, and it's now still that Netanyahu is part of some deep state conspiracy. That's ludicrous. And so I say to people, I have friends that they point out these things. I never denied that Israel was founded. Shimon Peres was a socialist till they died. I mean, yes, those people were in place. But it also obscures the fact that despite all those things, God is in absolute control of the whole thing. He always was, he always will be. And so to some degree, this is why I don't worry about Israel. I don't. I don't ever buy into this stuff of, is Israel going to go down? Are they going to cease to exist? And the cover stories in magazines, Israel's in peril. No, because the Bible tells me they're there permanently.
Yeah.
So that's what we should focus on. But as you said, the church is so dysfunctional in these things, in these matters, that even Christians don't know that. I know pro-Israel Christians who worry that Israel's going to disappear. And I want to say, do you hear yourself? Read the Bible. If you have to reread these passages, that's good enough for me.
Right.
As you said, Amos 9:15, God says, when I bring you back a final time, you will never be uprooted again.
Right.
I don't worry about some army expelling the Jews from Judea, Samaria, like the Romans did. That's not going to happen anymore. So stop worrying about things like that. Stop buying into the conspiracy theories. But to wrap this up here, again, we're in this position because of mass biblical ignorance in America.
Right.
That's why we're where we're at.
And this is something that I think people really need to understand. And we alluded to it a little bit earlier, but please look at history on this and realize that when I think you could make the same case that when the time was right, God had said it was going to be 70 years that his people would be in captivity. They were conquered and taken away captive by Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. During that 70 years, Babylon falls to the Persians. A guy named Zerubbabel, who we know very little about, is the one who is tasked with going back and beginning the process of rebuilding things. And it was bankrolled by Cyrus, the Persian king. Sound familiar? So people going back in a place mostly of unbelief, bankrolled by a foreign entity, putting them back in the land, but it was because God said so. How do I know that Zerubbabel and the people who went with him were probably not all that together spiritually? Look at the condition of things when Ezra and Nehemiah are doing their things. So once again, God restored them into the land because he said he was going to do it. Is there the potential? And even with those people, I'll buy into your theory. Let me stipulate. Okay, some foreign power comes onto the planet and expels Israel again. All right, that triggers the watch to start ticking again until God brings them back, because Amos can't fail. That's just got to be the way that it is. But if you're trying to tell me that there is time in this world's future for Israel to be displaced and then brought back again when everything else in the world is leading to the place where the Antichrist is ready to be revealed, there's just too many other things happening everywhere else in the world for me to think that somehow Israel could be displaced, because if they are, they have to come back. It's a non-negotiable as far as the Bible's concerned. It's not a matter of well, that's your interpretation. I mean, it's the very clear teaching of Scripture.
Well, and further to that, I don't believe that the Bible says there wouldn't be some form of a Palestinian state in the land. What the Bible says is the Jews are there and they're not leaving. They're not going anywhere.
Right.
So, in Oslo, we know has been pushed for 30 years. It's one of the dumbest models anybody ever came up with. It was never workable, based on the goodwill of the PLO. Hello. But I maintain I'm really big on the last chapters of Zechariah.
Mm-hmm.
And I've thought for a long time that the trigger to all that will be Oslo, will be the two-state solution. Because notice, even when you have moments of sanity in politics like Trump and Netanyahu, the left never stops pushing the two-state solution.
Right.
So could there be some limited governmental thing in Judea, Samaria, or Gaza, or wherever? Maybe, but that in no way damages Bible prophecy.
Right.
The big picture is God is going to bring them back a final time, the Jews, and they're not going anywhere. Like an Israeli friend told me a while back, he said, Jim, look, there's 400,000 Jews in Judea, Samaria. They're not going anywhere. You can't, what mechanism is going to come in and dislodge them? It's not going to happen. Now, we know that, Gog, Magog, and Zechariah, those will be efforts to dislodge them. But God says, I will not allow it.
Right.
And again, I'm mystified as to why professing Christians in the United States can't read these clear things in the Bible and simply believe them.
Right.
So,
well, let's address something, because it always gets brought up in these discussions too, and that being the Abraham Accords. And I get into this discussion with people a lot of times, and I ask them, have you ever read it? Do you know what's in it? And most people have no idea other than what they've been told. Well, it's ultimately land for peace. Okay. If they really have ever read it, they would understand that doesn't really describe what it is. I'm not a fan of it because, again, I think, to me personally, I don't think the Antichrist will come in on the platform of Oslo. He would come in on something more like the Abraham Accords. But people need to know what they actually are. So when they say, well, Israel should never give up land, if you've ever looked at the maps that are part of the Abraham Accords, it really takes what is already in existence and kind of formalizes it. And it assumes that the Palestinian Authority will absolutely disarm and cease all of their terrorist things and all the rest of it. And in that world, then they could go ahead and share the territory with Israel, who has right of refusal if the PA doesn't do their thing, or the PLO, as you would say. And so they don't understand that the front end of it is that people need to swear off on all of their nefarious dealings towards Israel and all their backhanded things, really their ulterior motive is to get rid of Israel. All of that stuff needs to go away so that they can just open up in what is a business proposal, and then they can start talking about land after that. But it's not front loaded like it's always been in the past. So the Abraham Accords is a business proposal and not land for peace. If people read it carefully, they'll know that. And it actually distinguishes the difference between, quote, Palestinian people and the terrorist organizations like Hamas. And something that you had mentioned earlier, people need to understand, Israel did not start Hamas. They had a charter written back in 1988. People can go back and look at the whole thing. The idea that Israel created Hamas is just, people believe that's the problem with conspiracies. You believe one, you start to believe all of them. And the absurdity of it all is just insane. But let's make sure that people understand when it comes to the Abraham Accords, regardless of whether you like them or not, I really do believe that the Antichrist will really kind of want to do something more like this, because it's more of a business proposal than it is land for peace.
Precisely. I'm pretty confident in saying that the Saudis, the Jordanians, even the Egyptians, the UAE, all of these groups, all these states, whatever they say publicly about supporting a Palestinian state, that's that's a sop they throw to the Palestinians. The problem with the Palestinians is, as a people, as a group, they are radicalized more than the other groups. They have been permanently damaged by the Arafats of the world. And so the quote Palestinian Arabs are in 500 years left to themselves, they're not going to progress 1 inch.
Right.
And so I do not believe that privately, and I'm sure this is coming out in negotiations behind the scenes, the Saudis aren't in love with the Palestinian people. They don't care if there's a Palestinian state.
Right.
They're probably more interested in the lucrative business stuff
Right.
that can come from all this. And that's why, this is Trump's bailiwick. I mean, now there's pros and cons to that, because as a businessman, the consummate deal maker, he's able to do some of these things very well. The other side of that, though, is I don't think people should be under any illusions that Trump has any kind of biblical view about the Middle East.
Right.
That's just not there, I don't think. And so, there's the potential for harm there, because he's not going to be sitting with Steve Witkoff and his other people and saying, well, now, in Genesis 15, it says here, they don't do that.
Right.
But as you say, in the short term, at least, if there could be less violence, that's not a good thing. My late mentor, Bible prophecy teacher, David Lewis, he told me years ago, he said, look, the Jordanians don't love Israel and the Egyptians don't love Israel, but those two peace agreements that were signed have held. And he said a cold peace is better than a hot war.
Right.
And so I think maybe we should look at the Abraham Accords, at least in the short term, in that way, and leave the rest of it to God to sort out.
Right. Well, if I wanted to try to, if somebody said, you've got 30 seconds to try to explain to me what the Abraham Accords are different than everything else. And if I hit the clock and said, go, everything Oslo forward and even before that was always give up land and you'll have peace. And if you can say this in your best Trump voice, the Abraham Accords is this: look, you want to get rid of the crazy people like Hamas and the rest who are terrorists? Let the people in the territories prosper. So here you other countries come and do business with Israel. And after you've marginalized the crazy people, then you can start talking about where are they going to live. That's the Abraham Accords. And I think it's why the Antichrist would be able to use it, because it's a much more rational approach. Again, it's don't think for a second that I think, oh, these are the best things that have ever happened. I was just stunned at the approach when I read it for myself and looked at the maps and what they're proposing to do and all the rest of it. I remember having that kind of reaction where it's like push away from the table and go, I'll be darned, I've never seen anything like this. This is a different approach entirely, but it's written by a businessman rather than a politician.
It's really interesting that you bring some of these things up. I really haven't heard anybody go at it from that angle because, again, as you said, what the actual documents say is not exactly what is coming out in public. And the big paradigm shift, of course, now is, you know, October 7th was so bad that it was a wake-up call even a little bit to Israel's international enemies. It's like, okay, that they went too far this time.
Mhm.
And so now you have this stunning proposal that you're going to remove the Arabs from Gaza and send them somewhere else, whether that's East Asia, Egypt, whatever it is. That's almost unbelievable. None of us saw, I, chief among them, never saw that coming. I never saw. And so, as you said, I can see a scenario where removing the radical terrorist element can bring some normalcy to the place.
Mhm.
And over the next several years, what's going to happen is, the Bible says they'll say peace, peace, but there is no peace.
Right.
There will be a window dressing peace there and stability, which, as you said, that's the opportunity that the Antichrist would step in and
Sure.
exploit, not during the chaos.
Right.
And so the paradigm shift of the proposal of removing the Palestinians from Gaza that's one of the biggest things that's happened in my lifetime.
Right.
And I think they're actually going to do it at least partially. And so, as you said, you take Hamas out of Gaza, take them out of Judea, Samaria, Hezbollah's gone, the Houthis are gone. Now you've got a chance for some business stuff to take root. And maybe there will be a period of relative calm there before it gets worse in the last days.
And I've always been one of those who thinks, the idea that they're living in what is peace. Um, I think peace is misunderstood. It's not like everybody. I think this is how I view it because I've been in Israel before. They are always constantly, never ending on war footing because they're surrounded by enemies. So there's never a time when they would say peace, as in everybody around us loves us and everything is good. Peace just means that there is a cessation of hostilities actively. So if they're not actively launching, ordnance back and forth between them and some other country, anything short of that would be considered peace, to some extent. So, they've lived in a place. October the 7th, the morning that started before everything happened, they were in a place of peace because nobody's lobbing bombs. So I just think that we sometimes think for some reason that peace means like there's nothing going on and everybody's doing well with one another. There is a never-ending fear in the back of the minds, maybe even in front of the minds of many. Any day could be October the 7th there. And October the 7th is not a peaceful day, but the day before in their minds was, because we're not actively engaged in a war. But here's the thing that people just don't realize, I don't think, about Gaza. It's uninhabitable going forward. It's going to need to be leveled, and they've got to find a way to get rid of all the undermining that's been done because of the tunnel system. It's a revamping that needs to, it's going to be years in the process just to make it where it could possibly be rebuilt. And people can't be living there because there's no infrastructure for 2 million people. So they have to be displaced. But if you and I had got together on the 8th of October, 2023, and I had, you and I could talk about this, where do we see this 2 years down the road, and say that both Hamas and Hezbollah would be pretty much non-existent compared to where they are today, you couldn't have convinced me that. You couldn't have convinced me.
No, because I mean, what did we think about for years and years? I heard it from every direction. Hezbollah's got a stockpile of 150,000 rockets. They can overwhelm the plains area between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. They can take out Tel Aviv. It was a doomsday scenario, and I don't even remember a pro-Israel Christian or Jew having any kind of positive, I mean, and as you said, though, almost overnight, Hezbollah has been defanged.
Yep.
That was never, people say it's not on my bingo card this week, and that's
Yeah.
true. It was I never I now
Yeah.
how that I believed that I never believed Hezbollah would destroy Israel because again, I have to be rooted in only what scripture tells me. And so if it tells me that the Jews are not going to be destroyed in Israel, then how that happens, I don't know. So I didn't have any, I couldn't even speculate how would the Hezbollah threat be taken out. And then it was taken out in the blink of an eye.
Right.
That was a miraculous, that was almost a biblical level miracle. And so, yeah, all of a sudden, because of the stupidity and evil of Hamas, they undermined themselves,
Hmm.
all of Iran's proxies at the same time. So what is unfolding now, and what will be in the near future, is very different than what we thought, as you said, on October 6th.
Right. Well, and here's the thing that people don't really understand unless you're there. And I pointed out to everyone when we're there, when you're at Dan up in the north of Israel, you're looking down into what is modern day Lebanon. And if you look off to your left, it's a mountain range. You can't march an army over mountains and drop them down on the coastal area of Israel. No military person is going to try and march an army that way. If they try to march them through the flat land that's up around Dan and Caesarea Philippi and all those areas, that's a big, flat, wide open area that for thousands of years, people who would come into Israel would come in from the north. But that's so heavily guarded. I think Israel would say, "Oh, please send 100,000 people our way through that valley. They'll never make it to the border." But the reality to it is that Hezbollah could never win that war remotely. I don't care how many rockets you have, and Israel didn't have to worry about hostages, so they could just tear them apart. And so that part wasn't that big of a surprise to me. That's why Gaza's taken so much longer, is because they value life, and there are hostages there. But had there not been hostages, you wouldn't have anywhere near this. And that, for those people that just, again, they parrot the same tired garbage without ever thinking or looking in the mirror when they repeat the nonsense about, quote, genocide. They're using, first of all, the numbers provided by Hezbollah, which at one point got as high as, they were saying, 40,000 people, making it sound like every one of them was a civilian. There are 2 million people who call that place home. If Israel wanted a genocide, they'd have done it in a day, and it wouldn't have been difficult. It's like fish in a barrel, if we wanted to say it that way. But it's nowhere near that. But what options does Israel have? October the 7th was a game changer, and Israel was not going to allow a repeat of it. If Hezbollah and Hamas ever are to the place where they could ever pull off something like that again, it's going to be decades, because they've been that thoroughly decimated.
Yeah, I will always remember what I think it was Israel's defense minister on October 8th. He said something that I've never forgotten. He said, at the end of this process, Gaza will never go back to what it was before.
Right.
And I think they have had blinders on. I think Netanyahu and the IDF have had blinders on, and that has been their guiding principle. And so whatever happens, Gaza is not going back to, at least not for generations, to be a terror base against the Israelis. And
Right.
so, I don't claim to know anything that anybody else doesn't know. We don't know certain things. We can't know certain things. But if we allow ourselves to embrace what Scripture tells us about the region, you can't get any better than that. And
Sure.
and that's why, now speculating about the timing of Gog, Magog and Zechariah and all that, I mean, that's interesting. It really is, and it has some place, but we can't try to fit every current event in the news
Yes.
every day into the grid of Bible prophecy. Um, I mean, remember after Putin invaded Ukraine, all of a sudden, for the first time, Bible prophecy teachers were finding Ukraine in the pages of scripture and prophecies. And it's
Right,
like, why are we doing that? If that hadn't happened, no, where's Ukraine? We don't
right.
know, So we fall into that trap a lot in the Bible prophecy community of trying to fit this stuff into certain grids. We need to just let it unfold and keep our baseline, what Bible tells us in general terms is going to happen. And then the politics of the stuff will work itself out. So that's kind of where I'm at. But I aggressively tell people that if you think the Jews are going to disappear from Israel, you're barking up the wrong tree.
No doubt about it. Well, I know that we're getting kind of close to where we wanted to leave this for today, but we haven't addressed one thing, and I'll just get your take on this, and we'll wrap up. But I found it interesting that that you have the people that are now talking about and making the reports of the protests taking place in the streets of Gaza, of just the rank and file people who want Hamas gone. And that's the narrative that's being put out there. And so we're getting those news stories that the people in Gaza are now starting to rise up, and it's putting pressure on Hamas. What's your take on that? I already know the answer, but go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah. I wouldn't trust an Arab in Gaza to get me a glass of water.
Mhm.
I don't trust anything they say. In fact, they've proven that they're untrustworthy. They're very duplicitous in things they say and things that, we're for peace and this kind of thing. And they're not for peace. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately for them, they're human beings.
Right.
The Palestinian Arabs in Gaza have been radicalized for generations. And so all of a sudden, they're going to oppose Hamas. There's something else going on here. Uh, there's reports that Hamas is actually behind the protests because they're trying to humanize the Palestinian people in Gaza so that Israel and the West will back off some.
Yeah.
They want to present them as, no, wait a second. We're a reasonable, peace-loving people. They're not, but that's the persona they're adopting right now to lessen the pressure on them. No, I don't believe those protests are organic. I don't believe that the people even would have the ability to do that if they wanted to. We were talking earlier. I'm being a little bit facetious, but 1.7 million Palestinians in Gaza. Are there 10 of them that are decent moral people? Are there 50? Is it 250? Is it 5,000? There's not many, because the hostages that were released that met with President Trump, Trump was astonished. He said, they told me there is no innocent Gazans. They don't exist. Not one of them helped them in captivity. Not one of them ever tried to help them get away. They didn't even give them acts of kindness. So the idea that the Palestinians in Gaza all of a sudden want to throw off their Hamas overlords, I don't believe that. As
Right.
somebody said, Gaza is Hamas and vice versa. That's where it is. That's just my opinion.
Right. Well, there you have the perfect microcosm of land for peace. That was what was supposed to be it. We'll give them their own place and we can have peace. And it was the petri dish for trying it. And here we are, coming up on 20 years since the event. And what do we have to show for it? What we have to show for it is October the 7th. So here's what the world need to recognize this. Well, can't the peaceful people be able to exist there? Israel's able to say, look, we broke this thing so bad, people can't live there until it's cleaned up. So find someplace else to live, but you're not coming back anyway, because we're not going to give you an opportunity to start all over again, which is precisely what would happen. So this is why the idea of them having any kind of autonomy, the Palestinians having autonomy over their own place without actually not just supervision, but without Israel being there, you've already proven what will happen if you allow for that. So there's no going back. Everything has changed. Fortunately, Israel, for the first time that we've seen in decades, finally said, yeah, it's not going back the way that it was. And I believe Israel was, they had the reason to do it because of the hostages, but their point was, if we're going to go in there, it has to be broken to the point where it's not inhabitable until we do something with it.
Well, and as you said, the test case for Palestinian autonomy was 2005,
Mhm.
2004, when an American Republican administration, I think, duped Ariel Sharon. Sharon was the wily old battlefield general. But, when those Israeli generals get into politics, their discernment and wisdom go out the window.
Yeah,
They make the most horrifying decisions after winning a war on the battlefield. Then the political realm, they're just clueless. And I really believe that George W. Bush, Brent Scowcroft, probably Cap Weinberger, all that foreign policy group that advised the old man H.W. Bush and then his son, those guys were no friends of Israel.
right.
And when they convinced them to do the Gaza disengagement in 2005 and pull out 8,000 Jewish people living in the communities there, that was a complete disaster. It was a catastrophic historic mistake. And I'm sure Sharon would have been grieved if he had known how it turned out.
Mhm.
Um, and that proves that Israel can never wholly rely on even an ally to have their back.
Right,
Uh, they should never have pulled out of Gaza. They should have continued to settle the Sinai. They shouldn't have given the Sinai back to the Egyptians
right.
because they've never gotten anything positive ever for concessions to the Arabs. And so going forward, I think that Hamas October 7th will be such a national trauma that hopefully Israel won't make existential decisions like that again, at least for a long time.
Right. Yeah, I wish that people would really understand that. If not for the pursuit against their own interest for a quote two-state solution, there would have been no Gaza. There would have been no October the 7th. There would not have been the 1,200 people, murdered. There wouldn't be the 2 years of just devastation to the economy of the country. And now they're going to be faced with having to deal with, and this is where Trump came in. It's like, let's get the people out of there and we'll bring in foreign investment and we'll make it a place that you can use for tourism like Tel Aviv. And of course, people lost their minds over that. And of course, this is what I think Trump did. That whole golden image statue thing was him trolling those people. Do I think that he wants to put up a statue of himself there and rebuild the place and call it, Trumpistan? Come
Yeah,
on, get over
yeah,
yourselves.
yeah,
This is what he does.
yeah.
And the idea that he's trolling people into thinking that that's actually a reality, just stop. You're buying into the nonsense.
Well, the last thing I'll say is yes, for the first time, maybe I don't know, since John Adams, we have a president that actually supports the Jewish people in Israel. And so I'll leave with this. Hamas is evil, yes. The PLO is evil, yes. All that stuff. Iran. But I'm telling you, someday when the history of this is written, uh, we are going to learn just how profoundly evil Western diplomacy has been for
Yeah.
decades.
Yeah,
The
completely undermined.
the evil that they have forced on the Jewish people is unconscionable, and there will be a reckoning someday for it. But people miss that. The obvious boogeyman is Hamas. The boogeyman behind the curtain is Western diplomacy.
Love that. That's so accurate. So accurate. I wish that the church would be better about informing themselves, because then at that point, and I speak to leadership and the pastors, they need to be proficient on this so that they can tell this to the people. But sadly, that's not happening. This is why we do these things that you and I are doing right now. And this is why we take people to Israel. We want them to see what's actually true. It goes against the narrative that they hear in the news all the time. So,
Yep.
any closing thoughts on that then? Again, how do people get a hold of you? Anything you
Yeah,
want to say in closing?
yeah. Again, the Patreon page is the God that answers. I'm super excited about the trip in October. As you mentioned, we're going to see some things like Independence Hall, which I've never understood why Christian tour groups don't go there, but I can't really blame them. I was talking to a Jewish friend the other day who doesn't live in Israel but has close ties. And I said, we're going to go and we're going to go see Independence Hall. And my friend said, what? Where? They didn't even know what, their own. And so Independence Hall is where Israel was established in 1948 in Tel Aviv. David Ben-Gurion read the proclamation over international radio. The hall inside is as it was that day, and it's a really, really cool place. And then we'll go across the street to the Haganah Museum, which is the precursor to the Israel Defense Forces, the history of how that was built. So some kind of different stuff like that that'll be a lot of fun.
Right. Actually, our last trip there, our tour guide was pretty new to doing it, but her sister has been doing it for 30 years. And so they're always on the phone talking with one another. And a couple of the places that we went to, the seasoned, doing this for decades says, why are you guys there? So we go to a lot of out of the way places that normal trips don't go to. And so, if people want to go to something, they can look at our itinerary, and you'll find that if you compare it to some of the kind of the cookie cutter ones that you can get and that a lot of churches do, we'll hit a lot of those same, if not all of the same places, but there's a lot of places that we get to that tours don't ordinarily get to. So it's very different.
And we'll have the benefit of your warped sense of humor. So
yeah, well, there's that. But yeah, they will bring your Bible and bring your shoes, man. You're going to need them.
Gonna be fun.
Jim, thanks so much for everything. It's always good to get together with you, and we'll be getting this out to everybody as soon as possible next few days. And again, this just needs to get out. I'd like to say to all those that are viewing, if you're watching this and you find that this is helpful, please send this around. Jim's going to have it on his website and through his resources. I'll do the same here. But this needs to get out. This is a discussion that's not happening as anywhere near as often as it needs to in the church. So we're glad that you joined us. Jim, thanks again for everything. I value your friendship so much, and I'm grateful for you. And look forward to seeing you, if not before, when we get together in October.
It's mutual. Thank you.
Thanks, man. See you.
Yep.